But in 1990, there was a shuttle that took off. And I've mentioned before, I grew up in the shadow of the space shuttle. I lived over in Merritt Island, Florida, near Cocoa Beach. The north end of Merritt Island is Kennedy Space Center, and that is where all that took place. So as a little kid, I wanted to be an astronaut. My favorite movie was Space Camp. I wanted to I was all about it. And I followed the program, and in 1990, a shuttle lifted off that held the Hubble Space Telescope. The Hubble telescope was something that was really, really cool. Because here's the thing. A telescope on Earth, even on the most clear night, still has to look through layers of atmosphere. And those layers of atmosphere give a tint or just kind of prevent the actual view of whatever it is they're looking at. It limits how far we can see. So the idea was, let's put a telescope in space outside of the atmosphere so we can get a very good look at deep space and see the things that we've never seen before. So what they did, they spent tens of millions of dollars building this telescope. This telescope goes up in the shuttle in 1990, and they're excited about it because NASA is anxiously waiting the pictures to come back. It goes in orbit. They set it out, they point it in a direction, they take the pictures, and they wait on the pictures to download. And if you remember how internet used to be, it was just like a little bit at a time, and they're waiting. It's like if you ever had dial-up internet, y'all remember those days. But the pictures came in, and they were not clear. Something's wrong. So they tried again, and they waited, and the pictures came in, and it was not clear. Again, it was fuzzy. It was not the way it was supposed to look. Like, we just spent tens of millions of dollars. Something's wrong. So, of course, it's NASA. They have rooms of people sitting around thinking stuff up, right? So they get these engineers, and they figure out what's wrong is there is a defective part in this telescope. And there's a way that they can fix it. There's a couple ways. They could send the shuttle up, retrieve the telescope, bring it back down to Earth. They could fix it and hope that it's fixed. And then they would launch another shuttle back up, and then they would put it in orbit and hope that it worked. I said, well, that's an extra shuttle that we don't want to have to do. So here, let's try this. What they actually did was they made a lens, a corrective lens. They put a contact lens on the Hubble Space Telescope. They put it on a shuttle. The shuttle launched. The astronauts went and installed it. And when they did, they waited on the pictures to come back. And I've got a picture here. You can see the difference between the two. The one on the left there was with the faulty perspective. And then once they put that extra lens on the telescope, the pictures begin to come back clear. So you can see the difference in the detail of what happens when you're looking through the correct lens. What if we have a similar issue in our lives? What if we can't see things the way they really are because we're looking through a distorted lens? Having a distorted view can make us behave the opposite of how we should because we believe something to be true that is not reality at all. We can look at something a specific way and it appears to be one thing, but we're looking through a lens or through a filter that distorts our perspective. I spoke last week about how we have a tendency to see ourselves as a victim. Some people do, and that's that rut that we get into is everywhere you look, you see they're out to get you. There's always something difficult, and doing that enough times creates a distorted perception of reality in general. And we develop, without realizing it, we develop something called a cognitive bias. And when I say we don't realize it, it's because if you realized you had a bias, you wouldn't have a bias because you're like, well, I don't want to necessarily have a bias. Well, here's what a cognitive bias is. A strong preconceived notion of someone or something based on information we have, we perceive to have, or information that we lack. And what happens, these preconceptions are they're mental shortcuts that your brain produces to process information more quickly. Again, just reflecting back on last week, that's something that would be called a neural pathway. We take the neural pathway because it's quicker to get to where our brain processes that way. And that's a very clinical way to describe it. But you see cognitive bias all the time. Here's a couple examples. You got two employees that work for the same company. They're in the same level of position. The boss walks in, and their department had an issue. The boss walks in, addresses the entire department, and says, this is what happened. This is what was supposed to happen. This is what needs to happen next time. And these two employees, when the boss leaves, they start talking. One employee sees it as an opportunity to grow, sees it as, okay, here's where we didn't meet the mark, and this is how we can do it. Okay, I understand that. I see where I missed it, and I see how I can improve. The other employee says, who does he think he is coming in here telling me like that? Why does he have to be so rude? Why are they picking on me? Why is this? I don't even need this job. Now, it was the same information that both of them received at the same time, but they have different, and why? It's because of how that person is viewing things. Maybe that second person had a very difficult teacher, a very harsh teacher, or a parent. And so their view of authority is always on the defensive. Whenever someone in authority begins to correct them, it's just a throwback to what happened in the past. And then so the cognitive bias says, anytime an authority figure comes to me, they're going to complain. Or maybe let's look at it a different way here. Let's look at it from this perspective of church. Say two people walk in, and the one person sits in this section, one person sits in this section. And they never interact with each other during the service. But this one sits here, the other one sits here. And service happens. We have worship. We do hear those chains falling. And I preach the message, and they go their own ways. And they're sitting with their families at a restaurant. This one goes up and says, service was so good this morning. Man, they did that song. They did Power in the Name of Jesus, and it was so good. And Pastor started, he started talking and telling that story about Mark Rutland, and then he got to preaching, and he was battlefield of the mind, and when we started talking about it, man, it just really ministered to me, and I left encouraged, and it was awesome. This one goes out to eat at a different restaurant, begins to tell somebody about it, and was like, man, when I got there, they did that tired old Power in the Name of Jesus song. And he just kept repeating it over and over and over again. I get it. The chains are falling. I get it. I get it. And then Pastor got up there trying to pretend like he's T.D. Jakes or something, and he's not. And every time he does that, he's, and then he started preaching, and you know what he preached on? Battle for your mind again. 4 weeks. And he told me there's going to be one more. Time to move on, preacher. What's different? They both experienced the exact same thing. They experienced the exact same service. The facts were the same, but the filters were different. It's not the facts that are different. It's the filter that's different. We all know of siblings that were raised in the same house. You've got this one set of siblings that same parents imparted wisdom into both of them, and yet this one ends up being a success, and this one needs Jesus. How? And you may have seen that. You may have seen that and go, how were you raised in the same home? And this is like this, and this one's like this. It's not the facts that are different. It's the filter. Cognitive bias can filter our view of God. So if you've had a compassionate earthly father, if you've had a good dad, you're more likely to see God as relational and as caring. But if you've had a father that was abusive or absent, then at the mention of father, when you see God as a father, you would be more likely to see God as mean or as distant, as disconnected. Same God, different filter. And what we love to do is we like to take control on how we see things. And I like to be in control. I'll admit, I enjoy control. I don't like manipulation. I don't want to control people just for the sake of controlling them. So I want to do an experiment right quick. Raise your right hand. All right, thank you. Now raise your left hand. Put it right here like this. Okay, thanks. You can put them down. I just needed to make sure I could still do that. I like to be in control, and not for that. That was just for the humor of it. But I mainly because I don't like surprises. I don't like things to catch me off guard. But what happens is there are some things that are out of my control, and so what happens is we need to. That's what we're talking about this week is reframing. Last week we talked about rewiring. The week before that we talked about replacing. So this is reframing. Next time we're going to talk about rejoicing. That's going to be the end of it. We're going to rejoice because we've won the battle. But what we're going to talk about today is reframing. Reframing is when you identify and you correct irrational thinking. It's making the decision not to hold on to the old perceptions that worked against you. If you could picture it like the Hubble Space Telescope, they had to insert that lens to correct the vision. It's inserting the lens of the Word of God. It's inserting the lens of God into your perspective so you are now reframing what you see. Because here's the thing. You cannot control what happens to you, but you can control how you frame it. You cannot control what happens to you, but you can control how you frame it. Let's go back and visit the guy who's been our example through this mind battle, the master reframer, and that's the Apostle Paul. I love reading about him. If you're following along with us in our daily Bible reading, you can pick up the May Bible reading plan at the Welcome Center, or you can follow along on YouVersion. If you reach out to the church, we can get you the link so you can follow with us. But right now we're in the book of Acts. And I love reading the book of Acts and Paul's missionary journeys and all the things that he's experiencing. And you know, so we're going to go right back to the Apostle Paul here, and we're going to see some things about him, how he learned to reframe what was happening to him. You see, Paul had a plan. Paul had a vision. God had placed this within him when he was an evangelist and he was growing as an evangelist, growing in influence. Paul did all these missionary journeys. He went and planted churches, and Paul had this plan to take the gospel to Rome. If he could preach to and he could convert the Roman rulers, then he could change the world. Because Rome was the center of culture. It was the center of everything that was going on of importance at that time. Now, there was some eternal significance happening in Israel, in and around Jerusalem. But Paul knew if he could influence Rome and he could influence Caesar, he could change the world. So I can just picture him seeing, all right, this is what's going to happen. God has opened these doors. Yeah, I've gone through some stuff, but that's only made me even better equipped to preach the gospel. And so God's going to grant me favor. I'm going to the Colosseum. And when I get to the Colosseum, I'm going to stand on stage at the Colosseum. And it's going to be packed full of Roman citizens. Caesar himself is going to be there. And I'm going to start preaching, and it's going to look like Promise Keepers circa 1993, man. People are going to be everywhere, all over this stadium. People are going to be just laid out and just whatever. And this is Paul's vision. He's going to preach in Rome, and he's going to change the world. And what was the reality? Paul did eventually make it to Rome, but it was not as this big evangelist. It wasn't as this hotshot who was putting up posters all over town, who did direct mailers saying, come see this revival at the Colosseum. The Apostle Paul, also known as Saul, a life changed on the road to Damascus. No, that's not what it was. Paul went to Rome eventually as a prisoner, under house arrest, chained to a guard, a rotation of guards, awaiting execution. Paul had a vision. He had a desire. And it was God-given. God planted that in him. And it just wasn't going to come about in the way that most people would have thought. You see, Paul's circumstances were out of his control. Circumstances are almost always out of our control. As much as we think we have control and we can navigate some things, we do have some level of it, but there are some things that you just cannot control. You've been there. You wanted this job or you wanted this promotion, and it was you were passed over for somebody else for whatever reason. You know, you got this degree so you could qualify for this promotion, and you didn't get it. Or you prayed for a spouse. You prayed and prayed and prayed. And this person, you know, Mr. or Miss Right, shows up and you're like, they check all the boxes off. This is awesome. And then you get married. You're 2 years into this marriage, and they're not the same person that you were engaged to. You prayed for that prodigal son or daughter, and you believe that God is going to bring them home. And you're just like the father in the parable of the prodigal. You're out there looking. Every day you're looking to see them come home, and they're not coming home. And you're wondering what's going on, but they're out in their sinful and their destructive ways. And you're trying, because you've seen the mistakes that they've made. You've made similar mistakes, and you reach out and you're like, baby, I'm just doing this because I've been where you are. And they respond, well, don't you tell me you've been where I am. I'm not like you. I'm not making the same mistakes as you. And they're just getting further and further away. And you had this, God placed this desire in your heart. God showed you that they would eventually come back to Him. And you're not giving up. You're not stopping your prayer time. And yet they're still living in their sinful ways. Paul was in a situation where his circumstance was out of his control. He could have been discouraged. He could have wrote the church at Philippi and said something like, oh, my dear brothers, what happened to me has just been terrible. I wanted to preach before the leaders of Rome. I wanted to stand on the stage of the Colosseum. I wanted to speak so eloquently that the lions that were eating the Christians fell asleep like kittens at my feet. I wanted to see when I give the altar call, I wanted to see Caesar himself take the first step down the aisle and give his heart to Jesus, and then other people in the altars would have been filled. But that's not how it happened. No, God gave me this vision, and that didn't come through. So instead, I'm just done. I'm done. I'm so discouraged. I've been beaten, shipwrecked, snake bit, everything else, and I'm done. I'm not going back to church. That's not what he said. Paul couldn't control what happened, but he could control how he framed it. Here's what he did say in Philippians 1, beginning in verse 12. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. What some people would look at, you were going to Rome, you were going to preach in front of everybody, you were going to stand on stage at the Colosseum, but you're under house arrest. What has happened to me has served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. Look, I'm not standing here. I don't have posters with my name in it all over town. Instead, what do I got? I got somebody chained to me so that all the imperial guard and everyone else knows that it's God who put me here. That this is all for Christ. And verse 14, and most, not some, not a few, most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Other people were being arrested. Other people were being persecuted for preaching the gospel. And so what happens? That is a misconception a lot of times, especially when it becomes connected to religion. But whenever it's something that you're passionate about, if we just oppress them long enough, they'll give up. We will break their will. If we just oppress them, if we just throw them in jail, if we just put them in chains, if we just prevent them from learning how to read, if we just do all of these things to keep them down, they will eventually give up and we can control them. But that's not what happened. In fact, the word said, most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. It just inspired them even more. Hey, Paul was supposed to be preaching at the stage at the Colosseum. Paul was supposed to be running this massive revival. But instead, he's in prison. And I can see by his encouragement that he's okay with what God has in his life right now. So you know what? That kind of inspires me. I'm going to be okay with it too. And I'm going to continue to preach. I'm not going to stop doing what God has told me to do because they threaten to take my freedoms away. I'm not going to stop because somebody has a worldview that's different than mine and they're trying to silence or cancel me. I'm going to be who I'm going to be because God has called me to be that, and that is advance the gospel. Because, again, back in verse 12, what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Paul's like, I had a plan. God had a better one. This is a completely different way to share the gospel than I ever imagined. But God blessed me with prison guards chained to me so they have no choice but to listen. They're on rotation. So what happens when the next one comes in? I can just picture the soldiers that are like, all right, Who's got to be chained to Paul next? They're over there casting lots. You get to, and they probably even play some bets. All right, how many of you think that when he comes out, he's either going to be insane or he's going to get saved? That prison guard comes out. He's got a smile on his face. He was chained to Paul for 8 hours, and he was introduced to Jesus, who changed his life. And that happened time and time again. And not only that, but these soldiers had the ear of influential Roman leaders. I'll say again, you can't control what happens to you, but you can control how you frame it. So, let's see how we reframe our past. Number one, thank God for what he didn't do. Wait a minute, number one? You've been preaching this long and you're only at number one? Yeah. I'm not going to keep you long. Thank God for what he didn't do. See, it's easy to thank God for what he did do. When you start to think of the blessings of God, what's the song from White Christmas? You'll fall asleep counting your blessings. Oh yeah, you can think about all the things that God has done. That's the easy part. But what about thanking him for the things that he didn't do? When you're reframing your past, it's important to do that because you can look back and see the highlights, but it's important to thank him for what he didn't do. And it might take a while for you to realize what that is. Well, how do I know what God didn't do? It's easy for me to see what he did do. And what that does is that forces you to look back and see God's hand in the moments where you weren't sure that he was actually working. But you might have this aha moment years later. I'll tell you one of mine. When I was in high school, my youth pastor, who was the coolest guy in the world to me, he played guitar, and in fact, he still plays guitar. He posted some videos on YouTube or on Facebook the other day, and he was just shredding. And I'm like, dude's 50 years old, and he's still just wearing it out. So he was a cool guy. Anything he said or did, I was like, yep, that's me. I want to be just like that dude. Well, he went to college in Tennessee at what was at that time called Lee College. So at the time, I'm like, I want to be like that guy, so I need to go to that college. So he took us to a youth conference in Gatlinburg. And at that youth conference, on stage, there was a group singing that they were called the Voices of Lee. It was a brand new, this was their first year in existence. And they did a cappella, beautiful a cappella music. And I liked that. It was complex. The harmonies were tight. And I sat there and watched them. In fact, one of the girls that was in the group, I had sung with when I was in high school. And so I knew her and I knew the whole situation. I'm like, that's it. It was like a light shone. I remember leaving my seat and walking around the arena so I could get as close as I could. And I can picture the stage being there, and it was like a light was shining on me and on that stage, and I could visualize myself where I would even be standing. You're going to go to that college. You're going to be in that group. And it was the elite group. It was the best of the best. Well, my parents couldn't afford to send me to that school, and so I graduated that year and ended up going a different direction. I had a scholarship, music scholarship, to go to a different school. So I went to that school. I had some success musically in that school, grew my craft, grew the gift that God had given me. I competed in Teen Talent that year and won. That opened a door for me to go to Lee in the fall. And I go up there and I'm like, all right, I'm finally here. I moved to Tennessee. I'm going to school. I'm going to be in that Voices of Lee group, and it's going to change my life forever. I walk into the audition and I'm strutting because I'm like, yep, this is just a formality. It's already, the director, I don't know why he doesn't know my name already, but he's going to after this audition. And I sing my song. And I look over, and the girl that I had sung with at camp was over here. And I'm thinking I'm a shoo-in because when I leave, she's going to say, I've sung with him for years. Oh, yeah, definitely, he's in. I walk out, and I'm like, all right, okay, this is good. That's what's going to happen. A couple days later, they post the list. I go and look at the list of who made it. And I look on that list, and there's this name. I'm not on there. Wait, what? I was devastated. That's the reason I was there. I had that moment at Winterfest where I was standing and I was looking and I saw where I would be standing on the stage. Guys, I bought their CD and I learned every part of every song so that whenever I did get in, it was like, I don't even need rehearsal. I already know all the parts. And I didn't make it in. So, God, what's happening here? Why am I not getting what you told me I could have? Because I knew that God had placed in my heart I was supposed to go to that school. I knew that it was all going to lay out. It was all going to play out just like this. Why didn't God give me what I needed? Why didn't God fulfill his plan for my life? That wasn't God's plan for my life. God put a desire in me, and I had some idea of what it was. And so I pursued what I was sure of. I pursued what I thought I was sure of. But I didn't make that. So there was another group I auditioned for, and I'm like, yeah, that's my fallback. Oh, I made it into that one? Okay, well, I guess this one will do. And that was the prayer that God didn't answer. But the one that he did that I didn't even know was the best thing that ever could have happened to me. You see, if I'd have continued down the path of Voices of Lee, sure, I would have sung with some of the greatest elite artists in the world. In fact, Voices of Lee has since then has been on Gaither videos. They've been on a TV show on NBC called The Sing Off. They've been on a bunch of things, and that was the path for somebody else. God put me where he needed me to be. And what happened when I was there? I ended up being mentored by a director, Dr. David Horton, who poured his life into me and taught me about true worship, that taught me not just music, but music in ministry. And that opened the doors for me to grow in my giftings even more. A couple years go by, and I end up making it into a smaller ensemble that's more elite and does more traveling. God opened the door for me to go to Israel, and one of the highlights of my entire life is being baptized in the Jordan River, in the same river that Jesus was baptized in. All of that happened because I didn't get the prayer that God didn't answer the prayer that I had prayed before. So what happens in summer of 1999, same summer I went to Israel, that smaller ensemble, we're touring around. We got the benefit to go. More scholarship money came with that. So we're touring, and we tour Florida Youth Camp, and I meet this pretty young girl. And one night, God speaks to me. I'm on stage. She's down there. And he tells me in that moment that I'm going to marry her. It's Lindsay, in case you thought I was talking about somebody else. Now, he didn't tell her for 3 more years, but he told me that night. When I couldn't convince her, that's when he stepped in and was like, okay, yeah. So what happens? We begin a ministry journey that takes us all over the place. We experience highs and lows. We have 5 children, and it all leads to this moment right here. And none of that would have happened if I'd have got what I wanted. None of it would have happened unless God doesn't answer the prayer. I thank God for the things that he didn't do. Think about some of the worst situations that you've ever gone through. You would never choose to experience those things. Think of your darkest moments. You would not want, I've heard people say, I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy. In fact, during those situations, you probably prayed for God to get you out of it. You probably saw it coming and prayed for God to direct it a different way. You're right in the middle of it. You prayed for God to get you out of it, and you don't want to have anything to do with it. But they have been critical to the person that you are today. God has strengthened your faith through those trials. He has been with you through every single one of them. So we thank God for the things that he didn't do. Why? Isaiah 55, verse 8 and 9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. We trust what we don't understand because God's never failed. We trust when it's not what we want because his ways are higher than our ways. Instead of feeling like you're the victim of random circumstance, reframing your past gives you the ability to see God's hand in it the entire time. When you look back and you reframe what has happened to you, you might have been the victim before, but now that you see where God has brought you and you look, you don't have to play the victim because you know that God has brought you through what he's brought you through and been with you every step of the way. Now look, this makes sense. If God knows more than we do, and just in case you weren't sure, he does. If God knows more than we do, then he knows that there's going to be times that we're going to ask for something that in the big picture ain't going to be good for us. And so he's going to say no because he knows what's not good for you. Because he loves you, there are times God's going to tell you no. And the problem is that we never think we're asking for something that's not good for me. I'm not asking for pain. I'm not inviting pain in my life. I just want the good stuff, and you want me to have good stuff, so I'm asking that. Every good and perfect gift comes from the Father above, and this is good, perfect gift now. I mean, that brand new pickup truck is a good and perfect gift, right, God? I'm going to pray for that. I knew that I needed to be in Voices of Lee. I knew that I needed to be in the most elite. And God looked and said, no, you don't. I know it doesn't seem like it now, but what I've got for you is so much better. I was disappointed at that moment in my life. I was. But when I look back and reframe that experience, what happened didn't change. But I see that unanswered prayer as the best answer to any prayer that I've prayed, because that no opened the door to every yes that I've experienced since then. So I thank God for what he hasn't done. The next thing is you look for God's goodness. First thing is that we thank God for what he didn't do. The second thing is that we look for God's goodness. Like I said last week, you're going to find the bad, you're going to find the negative if that's what you're looking for. There are people who, are so spiritual that there's a demon behind every corner. There's a devil in every bush. And if you look for a devil in every bush, you'll find a devil in every bush. I choose to look for God everywhere that I go. Because if I want to find evil, evil is out there. If I want to find something negative to dwell on, it ain't going to be hard. But there's more of God for us to see and for us to dwell on than there is evil. And there's a whole lot of evil in the world. Think of it like the difference between a hummingbird and a buzzard. You've got a turkey vulture. Like we call them buzzards. They stand about this high off the ground. Some of them, the big ones, whatever. But you see them on the side of the road. What are they doing? They're eating roadkill. And some of these things, they have a wingspan 5-6 feet. I mean, these are big birds. If you're anywhere around here during the week, they will perch on the offices back here. And you could, because they eat out of the trash right next door at the restaurant. So they will land, and it sounds like an adult man walking on the roof. These are massive, ugly, hideous birds. What do? They fly high up in the air. They can smell something dead for up to a mile away. And if they don't see or smell anything dead, they will travel 30 to 50 miles to find something. And then when they're close to it, they begin to circle because they're smelling it. And as they begin to circle, they see it down there. Okay, and then that's the way they find. They will find something dead. If they have to look and look and look, they will find what they're looking for. Then you've got the hummingbird. It's about that big. That little hummingbird that has like a 2-inch wing. That has like a 4-inch wingspan completely. That little hummingbird that its wings flap 20 times a second. That hummingbird doesn't have to travel miles and miles and miles to look for something to eat. Because it's not looking for death. It's not looking for negativity. It's looking for life-giving nectar. And it finds it, especially in this area, especially around here, man. When you have orange blossoms. Up at Lindsay's family's cabin in Tennessee, they have hummingbird feeders that they put out there, and I love watching them. They come up, and these hummingbirds, because they look for something sweet. They look for something life-giving. Each of them finds what they're looking for. And when you reframe your past through the corrected lens of God's goodness, that changes your present. You'll find what you're looking for. I don't want to be a buzzard looking for death. I don't want to be looking for negativity. I don't want to be perched on top of some building just waiting on something to die so I can feel better about myself. I want to actively look for something that is life-giving, and you don't have to travel far to find it. Third thing, practice pre-framing. First, thank God for what he didn't do. Second, you look for God's goodness. And the third is to practice pre-framing. I talked about reframing your past. Now we're looking forward at pre-framing what's next. I want to choose how I'm going to see something before it even happens. Now, if I let my default frame, my default filter, if that becomes active, unfortunately, it's negative too many times. And that causes me to interpret what might otherwise be a positive situation. I interpret that as a negative. So what I have to do, what I'm encouraging you to do, is to pre-frame the situation. That means look at it ahead of time. That means visualize what God is going to do. You already looked at your past and said, I'm not going to focus on the negative. I'm going to see what God did, and I'm going to thank him for what he didn't do. We're already looking around us right now, and we're seeing the goodness of God. And when we're looking forward, we can now see and prepare to see the goodness in what God is doing tomorrow. A few years ago when I was working, I worked at a high school down in Frostproof. I was pastoring down there, and I also would substitute teach a couple days a week. And my very first time that I went to substitute at that school, I got a call to be involved in a self-contained ESE class. Some people are aware of what that means, some are not. This self-contained ESE class was what people would call the bad kids. They were the ones that they could not just be on their own, or they would get themselves into trouble or whatever. But they had this reputation. And so they were in a portable. They didn't change classes like everybody else. They ate lunch at a different time with different people. It was almost like in school suspension, but it wasn't. It was just for behavioral or learning issues. So I went in my very first time substituting at this school. I go in knowing what a self-contained ESE class is because I'd worked at high schools before. So I go walking into this self-contained ESE class, my first day subbing at this school, and I'm all swole. I'm like, they ain't gonna mess with me, you know. Acting like I was built like I was in 1999. But I went in there like expecting something to be a problem. And what happened was they saw that, and their response was about the same as mine. Oh, this guy thinks he's going to come in here and push us around. He's going to boss us around. He just don't know. And so what happened? For the first half of that day, things were tense. I walked in expecting them to be tense. These kids could feel that, so they pushed back. And then after about halfway through the day, I started to reframe what was happening, and I realized these guys aren't bad guys. These kids weren't bad kids. They just had no direction. They had no discipline in their lives. They had difficulty processing things. They didn't process things the same way I did. So I leveled off. And once I did, from that point on, the day went fine. And I had to learn not to go into that by pre-framing something negative, because that made the situation worse. Sometime later, I got a call to substitute in a different ESE class. Now, this one was for developmentally disabled students. This is one that one of the students was blind. There were some that were high functioning, some were low functioning. But this was, again, it was a self-contained class, but this class had one teacher and like 3 other paraprofessionals that worked in there, because that's how many people it took in order to keep order in this class. But because of my experience with the other class, with the bad kids, I went into that pre-framed knowing that this is going to be a good day. And so what happened? I go in, and it's an awesome day. I go in and I connect with these kids. I'm telling myself it's going to be a great day, and it is. I became their favorite substitute teacher. They became my favorite class to do. Anytime that they were going to be out, or the teacher was going to be out, he would call me and say, "Hey, Rodney, I'm going to be out next week. Are you available?" And I'm like, "Would love to." And the kids would always ask, "Hey, can we get Mr. Cannon to come back?" It's like, and the teacher was like, "No, I'm not sick. I'm not taking a day off." "Well, can you be sick so we can get Mr. Cannon to come back?" I loved it. Because I pre-framed, I knew going in, I'm going to find the goodness. Because they had their own set of issues, but I have my own sets of issues too. And if somebody comes to me and sees what God is doing in me and sees the opportunity to minister to me, I'm going to be much more relatable to them. So when I look at them and saw them as beloved, as children of God who had their own set of issues, but God loved them as much as he loved me, then that gave me the ability to minister to them in that way. When you're in a difficult spot, what do? You rise to the occasion. When things get tough, you have to know that God is with you. You reframe your past, you pre-frame your future. You can't control what happens to you, but you can control how you frame it. So how do we reframe the situation? We thank God for what he didn't do. We look for his goodness everywhere. We practice pre-framing. And as always, we have our offensive weapon. We have the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. That's the part of our armor that we've been given that gives us the offensive weapon. And utilizing that, Daryl, if you would come, utilizing that offensive weapon. One of the more popular and quoted passages in Proverbs is Proverbs 3, beginning in verse 5. It says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths." Trust in the Lord, and do not lean on your own understanding. That means admitting that you're not in control. That means turning loose and saying, "All right, God, yeah, but I need control. Pastor, you just don't understand. If things are careening out of control, I can't function when things are out of control." Oh, I believe that, and I know that. Trust me, I feel that on a deep and personal level. I do understand, but that is not the way that God designed it for us. He said, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Trust in him. And it says, lean not on your own understanding. I looked up that word understanding. The Hebrew word for understanding there is the word binah. What does that mean? It means discernment. It means one's own faculties. Another one of the definitions listed in there was truth. So you can replace that word with a different English word. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own truth. You might hear that a lot of times in today's culture. Well, that may be true for you, but that's not true for me. Look, truth is unchanging. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. He is truth. So don't lean, don't trust, don't put your faith and your hope in your own understanding, in your own truth. Do not trust what you see and understand, because your faulty lens will never give you a clear view of the situation. I downloaded Snapchat. I used to have this app, Snapchat, years ago, and I got rid of it. And I downloaded it when I was talking about lenses and filters. And they have these little things where you can push a button, and you look at the picture, and it turns you into something else. Like you can look at the picture, and it turns you into a puppy dog. Or some of you may have seen the thing that happened a couple months ago, this attorney that was on a Zoom call with another attorney and a judge. And there was a filter on, and he was a cat. And he's like, "Judge, I'm not a cat. And I want to move forward if it's okay." And the judge is like, "Yeah, I know you're not a cat." It was just this awkward moment, but there was a filter on, and it distorted so that nobody could see reality. It's time for us to erase these negative filters, these things that give us a false view of what reality is. And it's time that in the same way, that like the lens that was slipped inside the Hubble Space Telescope, that lens of truth is slipped into our minds, and we're able to see clearly through the lens of Scripture, the Word of God. We're able to see clearly through what God has done, and we can say hindsight is 20/20 because I can look back and I can see. It's easy to see the peaks, and sometimes we can't even see the valleys, but I know that God was there, and I'm thanking him for the things that he did, and I'm thanking him for the things that he didn't do. Look for God in what you don't understand. Reframe your past. Pre-frame your future. And what's the next verse? In all your ways, acknowledge him. All your ways. What are we doing? How are we acknowledging him? We're thanking him for the things that he did. We're thanking him for the things that he didn't do. Because thinking about the things that he didn't do causes us to focus on him even more. And it causes us to see the times when we may have felt like we were alone, but we weren't. He was always right there. In all your ways, acknowledge him. What else does that mean? That means look for the goodness. Look for it around every corner. There was this kid who had a difficult time. Everything was negative. Everywhere he looked, there was negativity. His mom said, there's a retired pastor around the corner. He said, let's go talk to him. The retired pastor, he got to talking with him. He's like, everywhere I go, there's all this negativity. There's always drama. Everywhere I go, I can't see God in anything. And that pastor looked back at him and he said, well, you and I are in a different place in our life. You can't see God anywhere, and there's nowhere I look that I can't see God. And in that moment, discipleship began to take place. Everywhere you look, you can see his hand. You can see him if you're looking for it. Will you stand? In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. As we begin to pray this morning, if you have need, you can come. We can pray with you. If you're watching us online this morning, you can type in the chat box that you need prayer. We will be praying for you. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. Do not trust your version of the truth. But in all your ways, acknowledge him, and he'll make your path straight.